It is July 1944. The deadliest war in human history is still raging. D-Day happened less than a month ago. The beaches of Normandy are still soaked in blood. The Pacific is a theater of industrial slaughter. Hiroshima is 13 months away. The world is on fire. And yet, in a grand resort hotel nestled in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, 730 delegates from 44 allied nations have gathered, not to plan a military offensive, not to negotiate a ceasefire. They are here to do something that in the context of the surrounding carnage sounds almost absurd. They are here to design the financial system that will govern the entire world after the war ends. The hotel is called the Mount Washington. It is elegant, sprawling, and completely ill-equipped for the task assigned to it. The plumbing struggles with the demand. The conference rooms are too small. The summer heat is oppressive. And inside these rooms, two men are about to fight one of the most consequential intellectual battles of the 20th century. On one side sits John Maynard Keynes, the greatest economist of his generation, brilliant, arrogant, ill with a heart disease that will kill him 2 years later, and representing a Britain that is financially exhausted, militarily victorious, and economically desperate. He has a plan, a radical, elegant, genuinely revolutionary plan for a new global monetary order that would prevent any single nation from dominating the rest. On the other side sits Harry Dexter White, an American Treasury official, less elegant than Keynes, more politically savvy, and representing a United States that has emerged from the war as the only major economy left standing. America has the gold. America has the factories. America has the military. And Harry Dexter White knows exactly what that means. Only one of these men is going to get what they want, and the one who loses will watch the world pay for that loss for the next 8 decades. The one who wins will hand his country an economic superpower the likes of which history has never seen. And the mechanism of that victory, dressed up in the respectable language of international cooperation and monetary stability, is what we are here to examine today. Because what happened at Bretton Woods in July 1944 was not just a technical agreement about exchange rates and reserve currencies. It was the greatest financial heist in human history, executed not with guns, not with threats, but with a handshake, a conference, and a piece of paper that the rest of the world signed without fully understanding what they were giving away. Today, we are going to go inside that room. We are going to understand what was stolen, how it was stolen, and why you are still paying the price for it right now. To understand why the delegates gathered in New Hampshire were so desperate to find a new system, you have to understand what the old system had done to them. Go back to 1870. The major economies of the world operated on the classical gold standard. Every major currency was backed by physical gold at fixed rate. If you held British pounds, you could exchange them for a specific amount of gold. Same with French francs, German marks, American dollars. The system was simple, disciplined, and brutally constraining. The discipline was the point. Governments could not print money they did not have. If you wanted to spend more than you earn in taxes, you had to either raise taxes or borrow gold. The gold standard was a cage that prevented governments from inflating their currencies, running massive deficits, or financing wars beyond their means, which is precisely why governments eventually wanted out of cage. World War I broke the system. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, every major power printed money to finance the industrial slaughter. By the time the armistice was signed in 1918, none of them could credibly claim their currencies were fully backed by gold. The war had made the cage too small. The 1920s were an attempt to reconstruct the gold standard. Britain returned to gold in 1925 at the pre-war parity, a decision that Winston Churchill would later call the biggest mistake of his career. The rate was wrong. The pound was overvalued. British exports became uncompetitive. Unemployment was high throughout the supposed boom years of the 20s. And then 1929 arrived. The stock market crashed. Banks failed. The Great Depression spread from America to Europe like a financial plague. Governments desperate to protect their economies began engaging in competitive devaluations. Each country tried to make its currency cheaper relative to others to boost exports at the expense of trading partners. The result was a complete breakdown of the international monetary system and a global trade contraction that made the depression worse for everyone. By 1933, the United States itself had abandoned the gold standard domestically. Franklin Roosevelt made private gold ownership illegal and required Americans to sell their gold to government at $20.67 per ounce. He then immediately revalued gold to $35 per ounce, effectively devaluing the dollar and allowing the government to print more money. It was a confiscation by another name. By 1939, when the war started, the international monetary system was a shambles. Every major currency was floating against every other currency with no fixed reference point. Trade was difficult. Capital flows were chaotic. Trust between nations was at a historic low. The war made everything worse. Britain in particular was being financially destroyed by the conflict, even as it was winning it militarily. By 1941, Britain had sold off most of its foreign assets to pay for the war. It was borrowing from America through the Lend-Lease program on terms that were generous in military, but not in financial terms. By 1944, Britain was effectively bankrupt. It would end the war as a victor, but as America's debtor. And America was in the opposite position. The war had been fought mostly on other people's soil. American factories had converted to war production and were running at full capacity. American workers were fully employed. And most critically, as every other major economy depleted its gold reserves to buy American goods and weapons, gold flooded into the United States. By 1944, the United States held approximately two-thirds of the world's monetary gold reserves. Two-thirds. In a single country. This is the context in which the delegates arrived at the Mount Washington Hotel. The old system was dead. A new one had to be built. And the country that held two-thirds of the world's gold was going to do most of the designing. John Maynard Keynes arrived at Bretton Woods with a plan he had spent years developing. He called it the International Clearing Union, and it was, by any measure, the most sophisticated and genuinely multilateral monetary proposal in history. Here is the core of what Keynes proposed. Create a new international currency that he called the Bancor, not dollars, not pounds, not any existing national currency. A genuinely new international unit of account that no single nation controlled. Every country would hold Bancor reserves in proportion to its trade volume. Countries that ran trade surpluses would accumulate Bancor. Countries that ran trade deficits would spend it. And here is the revolutionary part. Countries that ran persistent surpluses would face a penalty. You are running a huge trade surplus year after year. Under Keynes' system, you would be charged interest on your excess Bancor holdings. The incentive would be for surplus countries to spend their surplus by importing more from deficit countries. The system would automatically correct imbalances rather than allowing them to accumulate. It was elegant, it was fair, and it explicitly prevented any single nation from gaining the kind of structural advantage that comes from having the world's reserve currency. Keynes knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to prevent what Britain had suffered under the old system, the inability in the economy to adjust its exchange rate, because doing so would violate the gold peg, from being replaced by a new tyranny, where the currency of the most powerful nation became the de facto global standard, and that nation could print its way to prosperity at everyone else's expense. Harry Dexter White looked at Keynes' proposal and saw exactly what it would prevent: American dominance. White's counterproposal was simpler and served American interests directly. No new international currency. The dollar would serve as the world's reserve currency. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar at a fixed rate. The dollar itself would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Any foreign government that wanted gold could exchange dollars for it at that rate. The stability of the whole system would rest on the credibility of the American commitment to maintain that gold exchange. In exchange, White proposed creating the International Monetary Fund to provide short-term financing to countries with balance of payments problems, and what would become the World Bank to finance post-war reconstruction. These institutions would be funded by member contributions and governed by voting structures weighted by financial contribution. America, as the largest contributor, would have effective veto power over both. The debate between Keynes and White played out across 3 weeks of meetings in the New Hampshire heat. Keynes was brilliant, but negotiating from weakness. Britain needed American financial support to survive the post-war period. He could not afford to make an enemy of the Treasury Secretary. White understood this leverage perfectly. When the final agreement was reached, it was White's plan with Keynes's institutions. The Bancor never existed. The dollar was the king. Keynes signed the agreement. He had no real choice. He returned to Britain and died 2 years later, reportedly telling friends that the Americans had taken advantage of Britain's financial desperation. He was right, but the damage was done. Let's be precise about what the Bretton Woods Agreement actually created, because the mechanism matters enormously. Every signatory nation agreed to peg its currency to the U.S. dollar at a fixed exchange rate. The French franc, the British pound, the Japanese yen, the West German Deutschmark, all fixed the dollar within a narrow band of plus or minus 1%. If a currency drifted outside that band, the relevant central bank was required to intervene in foreign exchange markets to bring it back. The dollar itself was fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. This was the linchpin of the entire system. Any foreign government or central bank could present dollars to the United States Treasury and receive gold in exchange at that fixed rate. Not citizens, not private holders, but official institutions. What this meant in practice was that the dollar was as good as gold, better than gold in some ways, because dollars could be used in transactions while gold had to be physically shipped. Countries held dollars as their reserve assets. They used dollars in international trade. They measured their exchange rates against dollars. The dollar was not just America's currency. It was the world's currency. And what did the United States get in exchange for this arrangement? The extraordinary privilege that French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing would famously call the exorbitant privilege. Because America could print dollars that other countries were required to hold as reserves, America could effectively import goods and services from the rest of the world in exchange for paper that cost almost nothing to produce. Every dollar printed by the Federal Reserve that ended up in a foreign central bank's vault was a dollar's worth of real goods and services that America had received essentially for free. This is not a small thing. This is the most valuable economic position that has ever existed in modern monetary history. The ability to exchange paper for real wealth is the dream of every government that has ever existed. Rome debased its silver coins. Weimar Germany printed marks. Zimbabwe printed billions. Most countries that try this end up with hyperinflation. America did it and called it the international monetary system. The system worked in its early years because America had the gold to back it up. Fort Knox held the world's largest gold reserve. The commitment to exchange dollar for gold at $35 was credible because the gold was physically there. And in the post-war period, the system produced genuine stability. European economies rebuilt. Japan industrialized. Global trade expanded dramatically. The Bretton Woods era was in many respects the golden age of Western economic development. But it contained a flaw that Keynes had identified and White had chosen to ignore. A fatal flaw built into the very design. The flaw was first called out loudly not by an economist, but by a French general. Charles de Gaulle did not trust Americans. He did not trust the dollar. And he had a finance minister named Jacques Rueff, who had been warning since the early 1960s that the Bretton Woods system was structurally fraudulent. Rueff's argument was simple. America was running balance of payments deficits, spending more abroad than it was earning, and financing those deficits by printing dollars that other countries were required to hold. America was exporting inflation to the world and calling it a reserve currency. De Gaulle decided to call the bluff. In February 1965, he held a press conference and delivered a speech that sent shock waves through the U.S. Treasury. France, he announced, will begin converting its dollar reserves into physical gold at the official $35 per ounce rate. France had the legal right to do this under the Bretton Woods Agreement. De Gaulle was simply exercising a right that had always existed on paper, but that everyone had agreed by convention not to actually use. The Americans were furious. De Gaulle was accused of economic warfare, of undermining Allied solidarity, of destabilizing the entire international system. De Gaulle was unmoved. France sent ships to New York to collect the gold. The gold was physically loaded and transported back to Paris. Other countries watched. Some quietly began making their own inquiries. The Bank of England made a significant dollar-to-gold conversion in 1971. West Germany, alarmed by American inflation being imported to the fixed exchange rate, had already floated the Deutschmark earlier that year, effectively stepping out of the Bretton Woods system. The deeper problem that de Gaulle had identified was what the economist Robert Triffin had formalized in the early 1960s as the Triffin dilemma. Here is a paradox at the heart of Bretton Woods. For the world economy to grow, it needs an expanding supply of reserve assets, dollars. For the dollar supply to expand, America must run balance of payments deficits. But if America runs persistent deficits, the credibility of the dollar's gold backing eventually collapses. You cannot simultaneously provide the world with enough dollars to fund growing global trade and maintain the gold backing at $35 per ounce. The two requirements are mathematically incompatible. It is only a matter of time before the contradiction destroys the system. Vietnam made the timeline shorter. The Great Society made it shorter still. Lyndon Johnson wanted to be the president who ended poverty in America and won the Vietnam War simultaneously. The guns and butter strategy. Both ambitions required enormous amounts of money that the U.S. did not have in tax revenues. So the government spent it anyway. The Federal Reserve accommodated the deficit spending by expanding the money supply. More dollars flowed into the world economy. More dollars ended up in foreign central banks. And more foreign central banks began doing the math that the French had already done. The dollars they were holding were not fully backed by gold. The amount of gold in Fort Knox was insufficient to redeem all the dollars outstanding at $35 per ounce. The promise was becoming a fiction. Between 1958 and 1971, America's gold reserves fell from $22 billion to $10 billion. In the same period, dollars held by foreign central banks increased from $15 billion to $50 billion. The gap between what was owed and what could be delivered was growing every year. The system was a bank run waiting to happen. The only question was when the first major holder would decide to get their gold before the window closed. The Nixon administration inherited this ticking time bomb. Nixon himself was not especially interested in monetary economics, but his Treasury Secretary, John Connally, understood the situation perfectly. Connally had a famous phrase that he would later use to foreign finance ministers when they complained about the dollar. The dollar is our currency, but it is your problem. It was not diplomatic. It was accurate. By the summer of 1971, the situation was reaching a crisis point. Britain submitted a request to convert $3 billion in dollars into gold. A request that, if honored, would have consumed almost a third of America's remaining gold reserves. The request was the trigger. On the afternoon of Friday, August 13, 1971, 15 men gathered at Camp David, the presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains. They were there in secret. The financial markets were not informed. Foreign governments were not consulted. The meeting would last the entire weekend and emerge on Sunday evening with a decision that would change the global financial system permanently. The men in the room included Nixon, Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, Economic Advisor Paul Volcker, and a small team of Treasury officials. They had three problems to address. The gold drain was unsustainable. The dollar was overvalued, making American exports uncompetitive, and inflation was rising. The options on the table were stark. Raise interest rates dramatically to defend the gold peg, risking recession. Devalue the dollar by raising the gold price. Or close the gold window entirely, ending the convertibility commitment at the heart of Bretton Woods. Burns argued against closing the gold window, predicting it would destroy international confidence in the dollar. Volcker was conflicted. Connally was decisive. Nixon made his decision. On the evening of Sunday, August 15, 1971, he interrupted regular television programming to address the nation. His speech lasted 15 minutes. He announced a 90-day freeze on wages and prices to fight inflation. He announced a 10% surcharge on imports. And buried in the middle of the speech, almost as an afterthought in the language he used, he announced that the United States would no longer honor the commitment to exchange dollars for gold. He called it a temporary measure. He said it was necessary to defend the dollar against speculators. He framed it as a bold act of economic leadership rather than a default on a solemn international obligation. He did not ask the other 43 signatories to Bretton Woods whether they agreed. He did not consult the IMF. He did not give foreign central banks any warning. He simply announced that the deal was off. The world found out on Monday morning. European currency markets were so shocked that several exchanges did not open for trading. Finance ministers across the Allied world were furious. German Finance Minister Karl Schiller called a catastrophe for the international monetary system. His assessment was accurate. Nixon's advisors celebrated. John Connally later described it as the day America took back control of its economic destiny. What they were less forthcoming about was the other way to describe it. The day America told the world that the paper it had been holding in lieu of gold was no longer redeemable. The day the most important promise in post-war finance was broken without apology or compensation. Here is a question that the official histories tend to sidestep. Was what happened at Bretton Woods and what happened on August 15, 1971, theft? Let's be precise. Between 1944 and 1971, every nation that participated in the Bretton Woods system held dollars as their primary reserve asset instead of gold. They did this because the rules of the system required them to peg to the dollar, and because the dollar was as good as gold, explicitly convertible at $35 per ounce on demand. That was the deal. That was the contract. By accepting dollars as reserves instead of gold, these countries were effectively lending gold to the United States. They were saying, "We will hold your paper in exchange for your solemn promise that the paper can always become gold." That promise was the foundation of the entire system. Between 1944 and 1971, the United States used this arrangement to import real goods and services in exchange for paper dollars that cost almost nothing to produce. American consumers enjoyed cheap imports. The American military was able to project global power financed in part by foreign holdings of U.S. debt. The American economy benefited from the exorbitant privilege for 27 years. And then, when the bill came due, when foreign holders wanted their gold, America said no. The paper was no longer redeemable. 27 years of accumulated obligations, denominated in dollars that had been explicitly promised to be as good as gold, were now just paper. Was this theft? The legal answer is complicated. The political answer is that no reparations were ever paid. No international tribunal ever adjudicated the question. The economic answer is that the countries that held dollars instead of gold between 1944 and 1971 received less than they were promised. The moral answer is something that reasonable people can debate, but the practical consequence is beyond debate. The nations that trusted the system and held dollars rather than converting to gold received worthless paper when the promise was broken. The nation that made and broke the promise kept all the benefits it had extracted during the years the promise was maintained. John Connally understood this perfectly. The dollar is our currency, but it is your problem. The problem was that you trusted us. And trust, once broken at the foundational level, changes the architecture of the entire system forever. Bretton Woods did not end on August 15, 1971. It transformed. The world tried briefly to reconstruct a fixed exchange rate system through the Smithsonian Agreement of December 1971, which Nixon called the greatest monetary agreement in the history of the world. It lasted 14 months before collapsing entirely. By 1973, the major currencies were floating freely against each other. The discipline of the gold standard was gone. The fixed rate system was gone. What remained was the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, now untethered from gold and backed by nothing but the political and economic power of the United States. And as we covered in our petrodollar video, the 1974 deal with Saudi Arabia gave the floating dollar a new anchor: oil. OPEC would price oil in dollars. The world would need dollars to buy energy. The demand for dollars would remain structural even without the gold backing. The privilege survived the default, but the trust never fully recovered. De Gaulle's ghost haunts every BRICS summit, where leaders discuss alternatives to the dollar. It haunts every central bank gold purchase we documented in our gold video. It haunts every Chinese decision to develop the petro-yuan mechanism, every Russian decision to build payment systems outside SWIFT, every African leader who wonders whether the IMF conditions attached to dollar-denominated loans are the modern form of the same structural dependency that Bretton Woods created. The lesson that every non-Western government drew from 1971 is the same lesson. Dollar reserves can be devalued at the discretion of the United States government. paper promises from Washington have a historical track record that is less than perfect. The only asset that cannot be printed, cannot be defaulted on, and cannot be confiscated by a political decision in Washington is the one that the Bretton Woods system displaced: gold. This is why, as we have documented in multiple videos on this channel, central banks from China to Poland to India to Turkey have been buying physical gold at the fastest pace since 1950. They are not speculating on the gold price. They are reading history. They are learning the lesson that Keynes tried to teach at Bretton Woods, and that Harry Dexter White's victorious plan spent 27 years demonstrating. Any system that rests on trust in a single nation's promises is only as durable as that nation's willingness to honor them. And August 15th, 1971 established, permanently and without apology, that when the cost of honoring the promise became too high, America would choose its own interests, as any nation would, as any nation does. The question that matters for you today is not whether this was fair or unfair. The question is what it tells you about the nature of money, the nature of trust, and the nature of the system you are operating inside right now. The dollar is still the world's reserve currency. The exorbitant privilege still operates, though in diminished form. And the $36 trillion national debt, the Federal Reserve balance sheet, and the global de-dollarization trend are all, in their different ways, the compounding consequences of a decision made in secret at Camp David on a weekend in August 1971. John Maynard Keynes' Bancor never existed, but the problem it was designed to solve never went away. And every major monetary crisis since 1971, the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, the Asian financial crisis of 1997, the global financial crisis of 2008, and the current era of de-dollarization and dollar weaponization can be traced back to the structural flaw that Keynes identified and that White's plan embedded permanently into the foundation of the global financial system. The day America stole the world's gold was not August 15th, 1971. That was the day America admitted it. The theft began in July 1944 in a mountain resort hotel in New Hampshire, when the most powerful nation at the table used its leverage to install its own currency at the center of the world's financial system, and then spent the next 27 years collecting the dividends. If you want to understand why the dollar works the way it works, why gold keeps rising, why BRICS is building alternative payment systems, and why the monetary transition we are living through feels so disorienting, you now have the foundation. Everything we cover on this channel connects back to this room, these two men, and this agreement. If this video gave you a clearer picture of how the monetary system you live inside was actually built, hit that like button. The algorithm actively suppresses this kind of historical content because it doesn't fit the 30-second format. Your engagement is what gets it in front of the people who need to understand it. Subscribe if you want to keep following the money through history and into the present. And tell me in the comments, do you think Keynes' Bancor would produce a more stable world than the dollar system? I genuinely want to know what you think. The best answers get pinned. Stay skeptical, stay informed, and keep watching.